He thought money could fix anything, until his own child proved him wrong. The private jet cabin glowed in soft amber light, polished wood reflecting the quiet luxury that surrounded Ethan Cole like a second skin. But none of it mattered now. Not the Italian leather seats, not the $30,000 watch on his wrist, not the silent presence of men trained to solve problems before they even existed. Because in his arms, his 6-month-old son Noah was crying in a way that cut through everything. A raw, relentless sound that had not stopped for nearly 3 hours. A sound that turned heads even in a cabin where people were trained not to stare. A sound that made even the most composed passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Ethan's jaw tightened as he adjusted his grip, his broad shoulders tense beneath a perfectly tailored suit that now felt like armor failing him, his dark eyes scanning the cabin with a cold calculation that usually brought results. But tonight, there was no enemy to confront, no deal to negotiate, no threat to eliminate, just a small, fragile life in distress that he could not control. And that truth unsettled him more than anything he had faced in years. "Sir, we've tried everything," one of the flight attendants whispered carefully, her voice measured, respectful, almost fearful, as if even her tone could disrupt the fragile balance in the room. And Ethan said nothing, only nodding once, his attention never leaving Noah, whose tiny face was flushed, his fists clenched, his cries rising and falling like waves that refused to break. Around them, the tension spread quietly, a ripple moving through the cabin as other passengers exchanged glances, some sympathetic, others irritated, but none daring to speak, because everyone on this plane knew who Ethan Cole was, even if no one said it out loud. And there was an unspoken rule in the air: you do not interfere with a man like him. Still, discomfort has a way of breaking silence, and a man seated across the aisle, dressed in a crisp navy blazer, shifted forward with a forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, his voice low but edged with impatience as he muttered something about the noise, about the duration, about the inconvenience. And though he didn't raise his voice, the implication hung there, sharp and unwelcome. But Ethan didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him, because his world had narrowed to the child in his arms, to the steady rhythm of crying that refused to stop, to the growing realization that for the first time in a long time, he was out of options. In the far back of the cabin, beyond the subtle divide between premium seats and the more modest rows, a woman sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight despite the weariness in her eyes, her clothes simple, worn at the edges, a stark contrast to the polished world around her. And yet her gaze was fixed, unwavering, not on Ethan, not on the luxury, but on the baby, on the pain she could hear beneath the sound, a recognition that came from somewhere deeper than observation. Grace Johnson had learned to stay invisible in places like this, to lower her eyes, to take up as little space as possible, because the world had taught her that people like her were meant to pass through unnoticed. But something in Noah's cry reached past those lessons, something that stirred a memory she couldn't ignore. And as the minutes stretched and the tension tightened, she found herself leaning forward ever so slightly, her fingers curling against the armrest, her breath steady but her heart beginning to move faster, because she knew something no one else in that cabin seemed to understand. And the longer she stayed seated, the heavier that knowledge became. The crying did not fade. It sharpened, cutting through the low hum of the engines and the quiet tension that had settled over the cabin like a heavy fog. And Ethan could feel it now, not just as sound, but as pressure, as if every second stretched longer than the last, every breath of his son pulling something tighter inside his chest. And for the first time in years, his control began to slip in ways no one around him had ever witnessed, his fingers adjusting again, more carefully this time, as if precision alone could solve what instinct could not, his voice low but strained as he murmured something meant to soothe, words that had worked before, words that now seemed to disappear into the space between them without effect. And Noah's cries continued, relentless, untouched by wealth, untouched by authority, untouched by everything Ethan had built his life on. A flight attendant approached again, slower this time, her expression cautious, holding a small bottle and offering it with a quiet suggestion, her eyes flickering between the baby and Ethan's face, searching for permission, for approval, for any sign that she could help without overstepping. and Ethan took the bottle without a word, testing the temperature against his wrist out of habit, then trying again, guiding it gently, patiently. But Noah turned away, his small body tense, rejecting it, with a force that seemed impossible for something so small. And the moment stretched, fragile and exposed, until Ethan lowered the bottle, his jaw tightening just enough for those watching closely to notice, though no one dared react. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer shifted again, this time leaning back with a quiet exhale that carried more meaning than sound, his eyes briefly meeting another passenger's before quickly looking away, as if even sharing the frustration felt dangerous. And around them, the cabin held its breath, a silent agreement forming among strangers who all felt the same discomfort but would never voice it. Not here, not now. In the back of the plane, Grace Johnson felt that silence differently, not as restraint but as distance, a space where something needed to happen and no one was willing to step into it. Her eyes still fixed on the child, but now her focus sharpened, noticing the small details others missed, the rhythm of the cries, the way Noah's tiny hands opened and closed, the way his head turned slightly as if searching for something familiar and not finding it. And a memory surfaced, not gently but all at once, a sound from another time, another place, a night filled with the same kind of crying that did not stop until someone understood what it meant. Her fingers tightened around the worn fabric of her bag, her thumb tracing the edge unconsciously as if grounding herself, and she shifted in her seat. Just slightly, testing the weight of a decision she had not yet made. Because stepping forward in a space like this was not simple. It was not neutral. It meant being seen, being judged, being questioned. And for someone like her, those risks were not theoretical. They were real. They were learned. They were remembered. A man seated beside her glanced over briefly, his expression curious, perhaps noticing the way she leaned forward, the way her attention did not waver. But he said nothing, turning back to his screen as if choosing not to involve himself. And that choice, that quiet withdrawal, seemed to echo through the cabin, reinforcing the invisible boundary that separated observation from action. Up front, Ethan shifted again, standing this time, his tall frame commanding attention even without intent, and he paced a few steps in the narrow aisle, careful but restless, his movements controlled yet edged with something new, something unfamiliar, as if the situation itself was beginning to rewrite the rules he lived by. And still, Noah cried, the sound filling every corner of the plane, refusing to be ignored, refusing to be solved by anything that had been tried so far. And in that moment, as the distance between effort and result grew wider, Grace exhaled slowly, her decision settling into place not as impulse but as certainty, and she rose from her seat. Every movement toward the front of the cabin felt heavier than the last, not because the distance was far, but because every step Grace took seemed to pull the attention of the entire plane toward her, eyes lifting, conversations stopping, silence deepening in a way that made her presence impossible to ignore. And still she walked, her posture steady, her breathing controlled, her gaze fixed not on the man everyone feared but on the child who still cried in his arms. And as she crossed the invisible line between where she belonged and where she was not expected to be, a hand moved subtly in her path, one of the suited men standing near Ethan shifting just enough to block her without making a scene, his expression calm but firm, the kind of silent barrier that did not need words to be understood. Grace stopped, not startled, not offended, just aware, her eyes lifting slowly to meet his before moving past him to Ethan, who had already noticed her approach, his attention shifting in a way that was immediate and precise, like everything about him, his gaze landing on her with a weight that made others step back without realizing it. And for a moment, the crying continued between them, filling the space where words had not yet been spoken. "Sir," Grace said quietly, her voice steady but soft enough to carry respect without fear. "I think I can help him." The words did not echo, but they landed, and the reaction was instant, not loud, not chaotic, but visible in the way the flight attendant froze mid-step, in the way the man beside her shifted slightly, in the way even the suited guard hesitated before deciding whether to intervene further, because no one expected her to speak, and certainly not to him. Ethan did not respond immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her, not dismissing, not accepting, simply assessing, as if every detail about her mattered in that moment. Her worn jacket, her tired but clear eyes, the quiet confidence in her posture that did not match the way the world would have labeled her. And behind that gaze, something else moved, something deeper, something tied to the sound of his son still crying, still waiting. You think you can do what no one here could. Ethan's voice was low, controlled, not mocking but not trusting either. Each word measured, each pause deliberate, and Grace did not flinch, did not lower her gaze, only nodded once, slowly, as if she understood exactly what she was stepping into. "I have seen this before," she said, her tone gentle but certain, and there was something in the way she said it that shifted the air just slightly, something that did not argue, did not explain, but offered something different from everything else that had been tried. The guard glanced at Ethan, waiting for a signal, and the cabin held still again, the tension tightening into something sharper now, because this was no longer just about a crying child. It was about a line being crossed, a boundary being tested in front of everyone. Watching, and Ethan knew it, felt it, waited in the space of a few seconds that felt much longer, his eyes dropping briefly to Noah, whose cries had softened only slightly from exhaustion, then lifting back to Grace. And in that moment, control met something it could not command. "Let her try," Ethan said finally, his voice quieter now, not weaker, but changed in a way that no one in that cabin had ever heard before, and the words moved through the space like a release, the guard stepping aside, the tension shifting, and Grace stepped forward, closing the distance carefully, her hands lifting slowly, giving him time to stop her if he chose, but he did not, and when she reached Noah, she did not rush, did not force, only leaned closer, her voice lowering into something softer than the hum of the engine, something that carried a rhythm instead of urgency, and for the first time since the crying began, the sound hesitated. Grace did not reach for the child immediately. She paused just close enough for Noah to sense her presence, her movements slow and deliberate, her voice soft but steady as she began to hum under her breath, a low, rhythmic sound that barely rose above the quiet hum of the aircraft, and yet it carried something different, something that was not urgency or pressure but familiarity, as if she was not trying to stop the crying but to meet it where it lived. And for a brief second, Noah's cries wavered, not gone, not silent, but interrupted, as if something in him recognized the shift before his body could respond to it. Ethan noticed it instantly, his sharp attention catching even the smallest change, his grip loosening just slightly as he watched her, not interfering, not speaking, but observing in a way that was deeper than curiosity, because for hours he had tried everything he knew, everything that had always worked, and nothing had made a difference. But now, in the span of a few seconds, something was changing, and he did not understand why. Grace's hands lifted slowly, stopping just inches away, giving space, letting the moment settle. Her eyes focused entirely on Noah, not on the man holding him, not on the people watching, but on the child himself. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, the words simple, almost like a lullaby, not meant to be understood but to be felt, a tone shaped by memory, by something practiced not in comfort but in loss. And as she spoke, she gently placed one hand against Noah's back, not pressing, just resting there, steady, warm, grounding. The reaction was immediate, subtle but undeniable, Noah's cries breaking into shorter breaths, his body shifting, his small fingers unclenching as if the tension that held him was beginning to loosen, and Grace continued, her hum blending with her words, creating a rhythm that filled the space around them, a rhythm that did not demand silence but invited it, and the cabin responded, not with movement, but with stillness, as if every person present understood that something fragile was unfolding, and did not dare disturb it. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on her, the usual hardness in his expression giving way to something quieter, something searching, because this was not control, this was not force, this was not anything he could command, and yet it was working, and that realization unsettled him in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding what he could not provide. Grace shifted slightly, adjusting her position, and with a careful, respectful glance, she asked without words, and Ethan hesitated for only a moment before nodding once. allowing her to take Noah into her arms, a decision that would have been unthinkable just minutes before, but now felt like the only option left. And as she held him, close but gentle, her hum continued, steady and calm, her presence wrapping around him in a way that felt instinctive, natural, as if she had done this countless times before. Noah's cries softened further, fading into quiet whimpers, then into uneven breaths, and finally into silence, not abrupt, not forced, but gradual, like a storm passing without warning, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost unreal. And in that silence, the entire cabin seemed to exhale at once, though no one made a sound. Ethan stood there, unmoving, his eyes locked on the child who now rested peacefully in Grace's arms, his mind catching up to what he was seeing, to what had just happened, and for the first time in a long time, he had no immediate explanation, no strategy, no control, only the quiet realization that someone he had not even noticed before had just done what no one else could. And in that moment, everything shifted. No one spoke, not because they were told to be silent, but because something about the moment demanded it, a quiet that did not come from fear this time, but from recognition, as if every person in that cabin understood they had just witnessed something that could not be explained in simple terms. And Grace stood there holding Noah, her arms steady, her expression calm, her hum now fading into a softer rhythm that barely existed beyond the warmth of her presence, and the child who had filled the plane with hours of relentless cries now rested against her shoulder, his breathing slow, even, peaceful in a way that felt almost impossible just minutes ago. Ethan did not move right away, his eyes fixed on his son as if he needed to confirm that what he was seeing was real, that the stillness was not temporary, that the silence would hold. And when he finally stepped closer, it was not with the commanding presence that usually defined him, but with a careful hesitation, as if he were approaching something fragile that could break if handled the wrong way. His voice lower now, stripped of its usual edge as he spoke. "What did you do?" And it was not a question of challenge, but of genuine need, a man asking for understanding rather than control. Grace glanced up at him briefly, her eyes soft but grounded, and for a moment she said nothing, as if choosing her words carefully, not because she feared him, but because she respected what the moment required. And then she looked back at Noah, adjusting her hold slightly, ensuring his comfort before answering. "I listened," she said simply, and the answer hung there, quiet and unembellished, yet heavier than anything else that had been said in that cabin all night. Ethan's brow tightened just slightly, not in frustration, but in confusion, because listening was not something he lacked. It was something he had built his power on, understanding people, anticipating moves, reading situations before they unfolded. But this was different. This was not strategy. This was not calculation, and he felt that difference even if he could not fully name it yet. Around them, the tension had shifted into something else entirely, the earlier discomfort replaced by a quiet curiosity. Passengers who had once avoided eye contact now watching openly, not with judgment, but with a kind of respect that had not been there before. And even the man in the navy blazer sat back in his seat without another word, his earlier impatience dissolved into silence as he observed the scene unfold. The flight attendant who had tried so many times to help stood a few steps away, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, her expression softened, not offended that her efforts had failed, but relieved that the child was finally at peace, and perhaps a little surprised at how it had happened, at who had made it happen. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding for hours, and in that release, something inside him shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone could point to, but in a quiet recalibration, a recognition that there were things beyond his reach, things that could not be commanded or bought or forced into submission. And that realization settled into him with a weight that felt unfamiliar but necessary. He looked at Grace again, really looked at her this time, not as a stranger, not as a disruption, but as someone who had just stepped into his world and changed something fundamental within it. And there was a question forming in his mind, not about what she had done, but about who she was, what experience had shaped that kind of understanding, what life had taught her to respond in a way that no one else could. And as he stood there, watching his son sleep peacefully in her arms, he realized that the answer to that question might matter more than anything else he had asked that night. Ethan did not reach for his son immediately, even though every instinct told him to, because something about the way Noah rested in Grace's arms made him pause, made him reconsider the urgency that had driven him for the past several hours. And instead he stood there, close enough to see the steady rise and fall of the child's breathing, close enough to hear the faint rhythm of Grace's hum that had not fully faded, and in that stillness, he realized that this was the calm he had been trying to force into existence, the calm that had refused to respond to anything he had done. "Where did you learn that?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice no longer carrying the sharp authority it once had, but something more measured, more human, as if the question mattered in a way he did not fully understand yet. And Grace did not answer right away, her gaze still on Noah, her hand gently resting against his back in a steady, reassuring motion that seemed almost instinctive, as if she was not thinking about what to do, but simply doing what she knew. "Life teaches you," she said after a moment, her tone calm, not distant, not defensive, just honest in a way that did not invite further explanation unless it was truly wanted. And Ethan studied her again, this time not looking for weakness or threat, but for meaning, for context, for something that could explain how someone like her had just done something no one else in that cabin could. The guard shifted slightly beside them, unsure whether to step in now that the immediate situation had settled, but Ethan gave a subtle gesture, barely noticeable, and the man stepped back again, understanding without words that this moment was no longer about control or protection, but about something else entirely. Grace adjusted her hold slightly, her movements careful, respectful, and after a few more seconds, she looked up at Ethan again, this time with a quiet understanding in her eyes, as if she recognized the unspoken tension in him, the part of him that wanted to take his son back, but hesitated out of fear of disrupting the peace that had finally been achieved. "He is not in pain," she said softly, her voice carrying a reassurance that was not meant to comfort a child, but a father. He was overwhelmed, and Ethan's expression shifted slightly at those words, because overwhelmed was not something he had considered. It was not a problem he was used to solving, not something that could be addressed with precision or force, and yet it made sense in a way that settled into him quietly, without resistance. "Too much noise, too much change," Grace continued, her tone steady. "Babies feel everything." And as she spoke, Ethan's eyes moved briefly around the cabin, taking in the details he had ignored before, the constant hum of the engines, the low conversations, the shifting lights, the confined space, and for the first time, he saw it not as a controlled environment, but as something overwhelming, something unpredictable, something that a child could not process the way an adult could, and the realization landed without resistance, because it was not a challenge to his authority, it was an expansion of it, a new understanding rather than a loss of control. Slowly, carefully, Grace began to move Noah back toward him, not abruptly, not in a way that would break the calm, but with a patience that matched everything she had done so far, and Ethan stepped forward, his hands lifting to receive his son, his movements more deliberate now, more aware, and when Noah settled back into his arms without crying, without tension, Ethan felt something shift again, something deeper this time, something that had nothing to do with the situation itself and everything to do with what he had just learned. And as he looked at Grace once more, there was no longer just curiosity in his gaze, but something closer to respect, quiet but undeniable, because in a world where he controlled everything, she had shown him something he did not know, and that was not something he would forget. The calm did not break when Noah returned to Ethan's arms. It held, steady and quiet, like something that had finally found its place, and for a few seconds, Ethan simply stood there, feeling the unfamiliar weight of peace instead of urgency, his eyes still on his son, as if expecting the moment to slip away, but it did not, and that realization settled deeper than anything else that had happened so far. Grace stepped back slowly, giving space without being told, her hands lowering to her sides, her posture returning to the quiet reserve she had carried before any of this began. But the room did not see her the same way anymore. The invisible line that had once separated her from everyone else had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that it could not be ignored. Ethan finally looked up from Noah, his gaze finding her again, and this time there was no hesitation in it, no calculation, just a clear, direct focus that held something different, something quieter but more deliberate. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same change. "You were not supposed to be here," he said, not as an accusation, but as a recognition of how unlikely this moment had been, how easily it could have never happened. Grace met his eyes briefly, then lowered them slightly, not out of fear, but out of habit, the kind that came from years of knowing where she was expected to stand in rooms like this. And she gave a small nod. "No, sir," she replied softly, and there was no bitterness in her voice, no challenge, just a simple acceptance of a truth she had lived with for a long time. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, as if weighing something beyond the words, then glanced down at Noah again, whose small hand had now relaxed completely against his chest, the tension gone, the crying replaced by a quiet sleep that felt almost sacred after everything that had come before. And when Ethan looked back up, his expression had shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by those paying attention. "And yet," he said, his tone measured, "you were the only one who knew what to do." And the words landed differently, not as praise, not as surprise, but as a fact he could not ignore. And for the first time since she had stood up from her seat, Grace hesitated, just slightly, as if unsure how to respond to something she had not expected to hear. The flight attendant stepped forward then, her movements careful, respectful of the space that still felt fragile, her voice soft as she asked if everything was all right now, her eyes briefly meeting Grace's with a quiet acknowledgement before returning to Ethan, and he gave a short nod, his attention still divided between the child in his arms and the woman standing in front of him, and the attendant smiled faintly, relieved, before stepping back again, allowing the moment to continue without interruption. Around them, the cabin slowly began to breathe again, small movements returning, conversations resuming in hushed tones. But the atmosphere had changed, the earlier tension replaced by something more reflective, as if everyone present understood that what had just happened carried more meaning than a simple problem being solved. Grace shifted her weight slightly, glancing toward the back of the cabin where her seat waited, the place she was expected to return to, the role she had always known, and she took a small step in that direction, ready to disappear again into the background as if none of this had happened, because that was what she had learned to do, step in when needed, then step away without expectation. "Wait," Ethan's voice stopped her, not loud, not commanding, but firm enough that she paused instantly, turning back toward him, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer tense, but full of something unspoken, something that had not yet taken shape. And as Ethan looked at her again, there was a question forming, not about the child, not about the moment that had passed, but about her, about the story behind the understanding she carried. And he knew, without saying it yet, that this was not the end of what had just begun. Grace stopped the moment he spoke, not abruptly, but with the kind of stillness that came from knowing when a moment mattered, her body turning back toward him while her eyes searched his face, not for authority this time, but for intention. And Ethan held her gaze in a way that made it clear he was not calling her back out of habit or control, but because something inside him had not settled yet, something that needed to be understood before he could let the moment end. For a second, neither of them moved, the quiet between them stretching just enough to draw the attention of those nearby again, not with tension, but with curiosity, as if the story that had unfolded in front of them was not quite finished. And Ethan took a small step closer, careful not to disturb Noah, whose head rested peacefully against his chest, his tiny breath steady, a stark contrast to the chaos that had filled the space before. "You said you have seen this before," Ethan said, his voice low but clear, no longer carrying the guarded edge from earlier, but something more open, more deliberate. And Grace hesitated, not because she did not understand the question, but because answering it meant stepping beyond the quiet boundary she had always kept around herself, the line that separated what people saw from what they never needed to know. She glanced briefly at Noah, her expression softening for just a moment, then back at Ethan, and something in her posture shifted, not defensive, not withdrawn, but grounded, as if she had decided that this moment deserved the truth. "My son used to cry like that," she said quietly, and the words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled into the air immediately, changing the tone of the conversation without raising the volume. And Ethan's expression stilled, his attention sharpening in a different way now, not analyzing, not assessing, but listening. He did not like crowded places. Grace continued, her voice steady, but softer now, shaped by memory rather than explanation. Too much sound, too many lights. Everything felt too big for him. And as she spoke, the cabin around them seemed to fade slightly. The luxury, the distance, the differences, all becoming less important than the quiet truth unfolding between them. Ethan did not interrupt, did not ask questions, his usual instinct to direct the conversation replaced by a rare patience, because something in her voice made it clear that this was not a story to be rushed, and Grace lowered her gaze briefly, not to hide, but to gather herself, her hands resting lightly against her sides as she continued. I learned how to help him breathe through it, she said, not to stop it, not to fix it, just to stay with him until he felt safe again. And the simplicity of the words contrasted sharply with everything Ethan had tried earlier, everything that had failed, and he felt that contrast settle into him quietly, not as regret, but as understanding. Around them, the few people who had remained attentive now listened in silence, not intruding, not reacting, but present in a way that felt respectful, as if they understood that what was being shared was not meant for judgment or sympathy, but for recognition. Ethan shifted slightly, adjusting Noah in his arms, his movements slower now, more aware, as if he was already applying what he had just learned without realizing it. And when he looked back at Grace, there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not just respect, but acknowledgement, a recognition of experience that could not be replaced by status or power. And your son, Ethan began, his voice quieter than before, the question unfinished but understood, and Grace held his gaze for a brief moment before answering, her voice calm, steady, carrying no trace of self-pity. He taught me everything I know. And in that moment, the difference between them felt smaller than it ever had, not erased, but bridged in a way that neither of them had expected when the night began. Grace's words did not linger loudly, but they stayed, settling into the quiet space between them with a weight that did not need repetition, and Ethan felt it, not as something dramatic, but as something steady, something that would remain long after the moment itself had passed. And for the first time that night, he did not feel the need to respond immediately, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to challenge, only something to understand. He looked down at Noah again, at the small face now relaxed in sleep, the tension gone, the distress replaced by a calm that felt almost fragile, and he adjusted his hold instinctively, not out of habit, but out of awareness, remembering what she had said about overwhelming spaces, about staying present instead of forcing change, and the way he held his son shifted, subtle but real. When he looked back at Grace, his expression carried something new, not just respect, but recognition, as if he had finally seen her beyond the surface, beyond the assumptions that had defined her place in the room before she stood up. You did not just help him, Ethan said quietly, his voice steady, measured. You helped me understand something I did not see. And the admission was simple, but it carried a sincerity that did not need to be emphasized, because for a man like him, acknowledging what he did not know was not something that came easily. Grace did not react with surprise, did not shift uncomfortably. She simply nodded once, a small, grounded acknowledgement that did not elevate the moment or diminish it, and she glanced once more at Noah, as if making sure he was still at peace before stepping back another half step, allowing the distance between them to return slowly, naturally. Around them, the cabin had fully settled now, the earlier tension replaced by a quiet normalcy, passengers returning to their own spaces, conversations resuming in low voices. But there was a subtle difference in the way people looked toward the front, a quiet awareness that something meaningful had taken place, something that did not belong to status or power, but to something far simpler and far deeper. Ethan shifted slightly, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, not in a rushed or dramatic way, but with the same deliberate calm that now guided his movements. And he paused for a brief second before speaking again. Where are you seated? He asked, not as a command, but as a genuine question, and Grace hesitated just slightly, her eyes flicking toward the back of the cabin again, toward the place she had come from, the place she expected to return to, and she answered quietly, in the back, sir. And Ethan nodded once, as if confirming something to himself rather than reacting to her answer. "That will change," he said, his tone calm, not forceful, but certain in a way that did not invite resistance. And the words did not carry entitlement, but intention, not to elevate her for what she had done, but to recognize it in a way that felt appropriate to him. And for a moment, Grace seemed unsure how to respond, not because she did not understand, but because she was not used to being seen in that way, not used to having her place redefined by someone else's acknowledgement. The flight attendant stepped forward again, this time with a quiet readiness, her expression composed but warm, as Ethan gave a brief instruction that was not fully audible to the rest of the cabin, but clear enough in its effect. And within seconds, the small details began to shift, a seat prepared, a space opened, a quiet rearrangement that reflected a change no one would have expected at the start of the flight. Grace remained still for a moment longer, her eyes meeting Ethan's one last time. And there was no need for further explanation, no need for extended gratitude or acknowledgement, because the moment had already said everything it needed to say. And as she finally turned to follow the attendant, moving not back to where she had been, but somewhere new, Ethan looked down at his son once more, then out across the cabin, his expression calm, thoughtful, carrying a quiet realization that would not leave him easily. And in that quiet, as the plane continued its path through the night, something had shifted that no one could measure, something that did not belong to wealth or status or power, but to a simple truth that had revealed itself in the most unexpected way. And that day, without noise or spectacle, dignity spoke louder than power.